Hey everyone, and welcome as we continue our study through the New Testament, looking at the New Testament church. And today we're going to be in Revelation 17, verses 1 through 18. And again, I like the one yesterday. I'm not going to read all that. It's a full chapter. And actually, the next couple I'm probably not going to read to you, just because I hope that I just don't like reading to people that much, and especially whole chapters at a time. And so I think more than anything, we're here to look at the idea of what's behind, or what the reading is about. So I encourage you to take the time to stop, take the read through it if you want to now, or if you want to listen to the notes or listen to my thoughts on it first, then go back and read it and come up with your own, or see how that fits in. That works as well. And so I encourage you to do that. But today we're looking at the Great Prostitute. And so this is a great drama here in this section, and it focuses on the powers that are hostile to God, right? And responsible for the persecution and the suffering of God's people. And so Rome's power, this is about Rome. More than likely, most scholars will agree that this is about Rome. Now, I know, like I've talked about as we've gone through this, there's other interpretations of this. There's people who put different meanings to it, to in modern times, and they've done that for, forever, right? And so each generation has had their own great prostitute, right? In the sense of trying to apply that to Revelation. But more than likely, this was about Rome, and because Rome's power was captivating to many. And you got to remember, in the context of the way this was written to the church in John's time. And so John purposely defines Rome's sins and provides God's assessment of that before outlining its fall, and then what heaven's response will be, looking at 18 and 19. And so it says one of the angels of judgment, right? That they address John, and they summon him to a new scene in which he sees the coming judgment of the great prostitute, which is Rome, who rules over many waters, is how it says. Rome was located on the Tiber River, right? And controlled the seats of power and water trade routes throughout the Mediterranean. They were extremely powerful, from the British Isles all the way to the Euphrates River. And so he talks about how those had adultery with her, and that's a biblical image of serving other gods. Right? Rome was serving other god, and they were drunk by her immorality. And drunkenness, many times in the scriptures, often depicts nations that indulge in immoral behavior, right? And so that's what John is showing here. And John then is carried in the spirit into the wilderness, right? He starts this out, he's carried in the spirit into the wilderness, and that's his way of describing that, he's having a visionary experience, and he sees a depiction of Rome's moral corruption, right? And the excessive luxury that they had, and it illustrates how such wealth can become an abomination to God. Now, there's nothing wrong with being wealthy. There's nothing wrong with having money, but it's what you do with it. And typically, what you see is those who become abundantly wealthy, ridiculously wealthy, they tend to fall into immoral behavior, and that's what had happened with Rome. So blessed, so wealthy that they fell into immoral behavior. And so the beast here is like the second figure in the evil trinity that we saw in chapter 13 when we read through that. And so she's dressed in purple and scarlet, and this clothing is, those two colors indicate royalty and carnality, right, respectively. And so if you ever seen anything about the scarlet letter, right? And so typically kind of some immorality and doing that. And so, using coded language here, or code language, John is probably trying to refer to Rome as the Babylon the Great, mother of all prostitutes. And so Babylon was a symbol of the idolatries that we see and demonic obscenities of the world. And so he's using the code words here to describe Rome as the mother of all prostitutes, Babylon the Great. And as mother, she had produced offspring who copied her character. And same, so Rome had done that. Rome, like Babylon, had prostituted herself to false gods and led other nations into adultery, and idolatry, and those type of things. And so it just kind of gives this whole scene of Rome's and Rome's immorality and everything that they were doing in their idolatry. And so then it goes on and talks about God's holy people who were witness for Jesus to the point of shedding their blood in John's time, right? And to the people that John is writing to, Rome was responsible for this persecution. Rome was responsible for the persecution of those who witnessed for Jesus. And so what we see here is John is kind of just awestruck. I don't know if that's the word, but he's just sits there in amazement and stares in amazement, and the angel now prepares him to understand this mystery. He's like, okay, I'm going to explain to you what this was. And so the beast, right, that once was alive but isn't now, but will soon come. And so what we want to need to look at, right, when Domitian, right, was emperor from AD 81 to 96, and this is what most of the time that a lot of scholars believe that the Revelation was written. He was an evil as a Nero, right, and so there's a lot of comparisons between Domitian and Nero, and both were huge persecutors of the church. And so, and many thought actually so much so that Domitian was the embodiment of Nero's spirit, if not Nero himself, or the reincarnation of Nero. Similar in some cases, not exactly, but similar to how John the Baptist sometimes was considered Elijah. Even though he wasn't Elijah, he was symbolic of Elijah. And so we see this same comparison. And so the angel uses the term "you saw," and so he uses the past tense here to indicate that the angel's interpretation took place after what John has saw. So John saw this. John saw the great prostitute, right? Everything, this imagery here, and so now he's explaining to him. Okay, you saw this. Now I'm explaining to it, and he talks about the one that was once alive but isn't now. And this contrasts with God, who is always, was, and is still to come. We saw that in chapter 1. And so it's in contrast to God's people, right? The people of the world are not written in the book of the life. And he goes on there. He talks about, hey, these people are the punishment that's coming for them are for the ones whose names are not written in the book of life, unlike God's people, right? And they will be amazed by the apparent resurrection of the beast. Those people whose name is not written in the book of life are going to be amazed by the apparent, what they believe is the resurrection of the beast. And so we see the 7 heads of the beast represents the 7 hills on which Rome was built, right? Rome was the city on the 7 hills. And so again, those 7 heads correlate with the 7 hills. And he says 5 kings have already fallen. Right? If the kings are representative, if you look at this, the way this lays out, these kings represent Roman emperors at the starting point for numbering them is when you switch from Rome being a republic to an empire, right? And so if you count this way, and a lot of people say this lines up the way, because this is when things started to go bad for them. It's when they went from a republic to an empire. You start with Augustus, right, in 29 BC to AD 14. Then the 5th in line, right, would be Nero. So you had Nero, which was the 5th one. And again, it says the 5 kings have already fallen. The 6th would have been Vespasian, and the 7th would be Titus, that we'll see here. The 8th king would then be Domitian, that we see here if you look at the way this plays out. So go back, read it, look through it, and see how this lines up. It's interesting how this lines up. And he says that was, but is no longer. Early commentators argued that Domitian was an embodiment of Nero's spirit. We have already talked about that. He was the reincarnation. Then it talks about like the other 7, right? This apparent invincible ruler was also headed for destruction. So the thought was, oh, Domitian is because again, they had these emperor worship. They worshiped them like gods. They thought that he was the incarnation or reincarnation of Nero. And so we see that. And so this is that parallel that we see. And then you see the 10 horns, right? And this is symbolic of the world kingdoms that follow the beast, right? That follow the beast's rule, and simultaneously is under his direction. And so there's been a lot of, what I would say, speculation concerning the 10 horns, like the 10 nations, whether it's going to be a 10-nation confederacy, a confederacy from the client kingdoms of Rome to the states opposed to the Holy Roman Empire, to the European Union, right? All the way through. And all this is beside the point, right? The 10 horns or whatever. The idea is that all of these nations opposed to God will be defeated. Everyone who's opposed to God is going to be defeated. So we could try to figure this out 100%. Again, I still feel like just reading this and interpreting this and understanding the context of who it was written to, that this was, this it's more of the people that were in Roman times and the nations that were there in Roman times. So that's where I think this falls into. But the idea again is whatever powers amass, it doesn't matter, the beast, the 10 kings, none of them have no hope, right, of winning because Jesus is Lord of all lords. He's already victorious, and we know that. And so, those God has called and chosen will remain faithful to Him and stand for Him as victors. And so we did. Those, but also the flip side of that is those who do stay faithful to Christ will be victory. And so, while the prostitute rules over masses, it doesn't bring her victory. It doesn't bring her any victory. And in the end, instead, the beast we see here, the beast hates and kills the great prostitute, right? And I think this is symbolic of Satan striking even those he uses for his own purposes. He used Rome for his own purposes. In the end, it fails. And the way this is described, the beast hates and killed it anyways. And so we see all that. And so John provides another reminder here at the end of this that God is in control. Right? God puts a plan into the minds of the enemy that will fulfill the Lord's divine purposes and promises and those things. In the end, again, no matter how you interpret this, if you pull it into the future and say, hey, this is this country's the prostitute, or this modern thing, even if you do that, in the end, right, God wins. And that's the main focus. That's the main purpose here. That is the main thing we need to look at is, in the end, right, we need to stay faithful. We need to stay committed to Christ. And we have to know no matter what persecution comes, no matter what troubles come, God's going to win. We're on the right side of things. And so we don't have anything to worry about. And so that's the main message of this. Again, I hope this makes sense. I hope that you learn from it. Like I mentioned earlier, if you hadn't read it, maybe, or even if you did, go back and reread it and apply, go follow along with the notes and see what you think on as we go through that. I encourage you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so yet. That way you can continue to follow along with us. And as always, I appreciate everyone who takes time to watch these, and I hope y'all have a wonderful day.